Hello, this is Stephen Wallace. This is my presentation called Linguistic Problem Solving from 1786 to Now. Here's some information about me. After graduating from college, I got drafted into the U.S. Army. I served in Germany. I then studied in Germany for a year. And then I went to Cornell University and got a PhD in linguistics. I taught linguistics for several years. Then I went to law school and worked as a corporate lawyer for many years. I'm now retired. This is what I look like. I have gotten interested in the subject of problem solving. Problem solving includes a number of steps. You have to recognize and define a problem. You develop a strategy to fix it. You organize knowledge and resources. You monitor progress. And then you evaluate the effectiveness of the solution. And what I've read is people who have studied this subject, which are primarily in the area of psychology and computer science, they've identified a number of problem solving strategies. I'm going to leave this slide here for a while for those interested to sort of look at some of these strategies that have been identified. I'm not going to go into individual ones, but just to let people look at some of the different strategies. In my case, I sort of like the one that's at the end of the list, trial and error. That's been a something that has ended up working for me from time to time over the course of my life and my career. But there are a number of these others that have been very useful and very helpful in the world of solving problems. Some areas that have attracted attention in the field of problem solving. Well, here's a list. I think it's pretty obvious. You have the world of politics, our common life, the world of business, the world of law, medicine, solving problems like a patient comes into a doctor and, the doctor has to figure out what the problem is and solve it. Well, that's just a simple example. Engineering, mechanics, electronics, computers, personal and social problems. We all encounter those every day. But in what I have read, which is, I admit, pretty cursory, I have not read much about the role of languages and linguistics in solving problems. So I want to offer some case examples of languages and linguistics in problem solving. I'm going to talk about three different subjects in terms of languages and linguistics in the context of problem solving. The first is analysis and interpretation of ancient and little known languages. The second is the authentication of writings on objects. And the third subject, well, I'm not going to go into the details. It's going to be a mystery until you bear with me and wait until I get into today's new frontier. So we start with the first example, Indo-European linguistics, starting in the year 1786 and continuing until now. Here is a portrait of Sir William Jones, a very important figure in all of this. And we move to some information about him. He studied at Oxford. He learned Latin and Greek, which obviously was part of the curriculum in those days. But in addition to that, he learned Hebrew, Arabic, and Persian. And it is said that by the end of his life, he had learned 28 languages, often by teaching himself. Well, after getting out of university, he tried making a life in what's called translating and scholarship, but it didn't quite work out for financial reasons. So he studied law. Does this sound like a familiar career path? Anyway, he was admitted to the bar, but he still pursued Asian studies, and he was knighted, and he went to Calcutta, which in those days was the center of British activities in India. And he was the judge of the Supreme Court in Calcutta. He soon founded the Asiatic Society of Bengal to encourage the studies of local language and culture, and he learned Sanskrit. Sanskrit is the classical language of northern India, attested from 2000 and many more years ago. Very important. Several years after that, he made a discourse before the Asiatic Society of Bengal on the history and culture of the Hindus. And this is his famous quotation: "The Sanskrit language, whatever be its antiquity, is of a wonderful structure, more perfect than the Greek, more copious than the Latin, and more exquisitely refined than either, yet bearing to both of them a stronger affinity, both in the roots of the verbs and the forms of grammar, than could possibly have been produced by accident. So strong indeed that no philologer could examine them all three without believing them to have sprung from some common source, which perhaps no longer exists. There is a similar reason, though not quite so forcible, for supposing that both the Gothic and the Celtic, though blended with a very different idiom, had the same origin with the Sanskrit, and the Old Persian might be added to the same family." This important quote is worth unpacking. He's talking about Sanskrit and Greek and Latin, and starting with Sanskrit. Now, in the modern world, we sort of skip these comparative things like more perfect or more copious or more refined. So we're going to just skip all that. But anyway, his basic point is Sanskrit, the ancient language of northern India, has a stronger affinity. And how? The roots of the verbs and the forms of the grammar. And it's no accident. No philologer, and here he refers himself as to a philologer, that is, a lover of languages, could examine these without believing them to have sprung from a common source which no longer exists. And there may be other languages that are somehow associated with this. And he says they might be added to the same family. Now, I think this word family is extremely interesting. I don't know whether Sir William was the first person to refer to a group of languages that seem to be related as being part of the same family. I haven't been able to trace that metaphor back, but it's common practice today to talk about language families. Does it go back to Sir William? I'm not quite sure, but that's what he said. Now, in a sense, he defined a problem. You have these languages, Sanskrit, Greek, and Latin. They have similarities, but they're obviously different languages. So there's a problem. How do you explain that? And his implicit solution was to say they descended from a common source which no longer exists. So there's an implicit problem and an implicit solution. Now, who cares about the Indo-European languages? Well, look at this picture of part of the globe. Indo-European languages are spoken in Asia from Bangladesh to northern India to Pakistan, Iran, and Afghanistan. And then you skip to Armenia and you skip to Europe and the British Isles, And then there's little Iceland up there on the top of the map. And there's not only that, there's the Americas. Hundreds of millions of people speak in the Americas French and English and Spanish and Portuguese. Then you have Australia, New Zealand, and other places. The Indo European languages, I have read, their native speakers, it's the largest language family in the world in terms of number of native speakers. And not only that, as we shall see, there are records that go back for well over 3,000 years about these languages. Without getting into too many details, Sir William said that these languages share, or the ones he was focusing on, Sanskrit and Greek and Latin, they shared affinities with the roots of verbs. So look at these languages, Sanskrit, Greek, and Latin. Look at the, sort of skip the orthography. I've used a hyphen to separate the root from the verbal ending, but look at those. They all have what's called a labial consonant, and then there's a vowel, and then there's the letter or the sound R. And just think about the English word bear. And then grammar. We don't know exactly what he meant, but here's some examples. The right column, Latin 101, the verb ago. It has various meanings that you could translate into English: to lead, to direct, sometimes just to do. But ago, I lead, agus, you singular lead, agat, he, she, or it leads, agimus, we lead, agitus, you plural lead, and agunt, they lead. And here you have these similar conjugations in Sanskrit and Greek. And don't worry about the consonant in the middle. It's all goes back to a reconstructed consonant. This is what Sir William was looking at and what he was thinking about when he talked about affinities among these languages. Some early leaders in the study of Indo-European linguistics, starting from this idea that these ancient languages like Sanskrit, Greek, and Latin derive from a common source which no longer exists. These and other scholars in the 19th century and continuing into the early 20th century, they developed a process called the comparative method, and they reconstructed this no longer existing proto-language. I'm not going to go into the details of the sounds and the grammar and the syntax and the vocabulary and all, but one thing I want to focus on is, I think, really interesting. One of these scholars was Professor August Schleicher, who was educated in Germany. He taught in Prague and in Germany, and he's famous for his great work. It was, of course, written in German. This is the title translated into English, a compendium of the comparative grammar of the Indo-European languages. And well, here's a photo of him. Isn't he the very model of a German professor? Those of you in the academic world, how would you have liked or to like to have him as your Doktorvater? In 1853, he published an article about how he viewed the attested Indo-European languages having derived from the unattested, reconstructed proto-language. And here is his tree model. Now, it's interesting, a lot of tree models of this and other things go from top to bottom, but his goes from left to right. That doesn't matter as long as you sort of understand the convention. But his original piece, it was in German. I have translated it into English and I've updated some of the terminology. But this is basically Professor Schleicher's tree model of how the Indo-European languages developed, as I said, published in 1853, based on languages that were then known and recognized as Indo-European. So you start with the Proto-Indo-European, the hypothetical reconstructed language on the far left, and you see all these splits and branches. And so you then get on the right to the attested languages or language groups. Germanic, well known today, English, German, Dutch, Scandinavian languages. They call it Lithuanian. It's a little broader than that. Most people today call it Baltic. And then there are the Slavic languages, Russian, Polish, Czech, Croatian, and others. The Celtic languages, not many speakers left today, but you have Welsh, you have Irish and Scots Gaelic. Italic, it's mostly Latin. There are a few other less well attested languages in ancient Italy, but it's basically Latin, which is, of course, the source of the modern Romance languages. You have Greek, you have Albanian. Nobody quite knows what to do with Albanian. Schleicher has a dotted line there, but well, other people have come up with other ideas. Then you have the Indo-Iranian languages, the Iranian languages in Iran and Afghanistan, and then the Indic languages in Bangladesh, northern India, and Pakistan, in terms just sort of modern things. This, we take this for granted, the idea of a family tree of languages, but this is not just something that crawled out of the primeval sea like a proto-amphibian. It was the idea of August Schleicher. And over the course of many decades since 1853, this idea of a tree model has been modified and criticized. Well, there are various modifications applied to the Indo-European language family, which I'm not going to go into, but just in theoretical terms, the structure of a particular tree diagram, it depends on the criteria used to determine the splits. But then there are the critics. Does a tree diagram with these clear splits actually represent how languages diverge over time? Well, not long after Schleicher published this, one of his students came up with an alternative called the wave model, focusing on changes moving crosswise. That is, not in terms of these splits, but in looking at his model, it would have been sort of up and down movements of changes or relationships between people. In any event, in the recent 20 years or so, there's been a lot of interesting scholarly analysis about all of this. Some scholars reject the tree model and focus on the wave model with additions of ideas of networks and linkages and other features. Other scholars acknowledge the usefulness of the tree model as a practical visual presentation of how languages diverge, but recognize that this is a starting point for analysis that needs to be refined in a particular case, depending on how peoples may have moved away from one another and their subsequent relationships with one another. What can you say about Indo-European linguistics? Sir William posed an implicit problem. How do you explain the similarities and differences among these languages? And these various scholars over the decades have come up with explanations in terms of reconstructing a proto-language and describing how that language developed into the attested languages and how the attested languages may be related to one another. And in my view, this is a monumental intellectual achievement that has gone on now for over 200 years, and it continues to this day because there are lots of unanswered questions. We now move to another part of the world, Egypt. Here's the Grand Pyramid. Here's the Grand Sphinx. The Grand Pyramid and the Grand Sphinx were both built around 4,500 years ago. And here is a bust of Nefertiti that goes back to around 3,300 years ago. The world of ancient Egypt has captured the imagination of a lot of people. It's just monumental human achievements. Egypt has a long and complicated history. Looking at these years that are approximately before present, starting around 5,000 years ago, you have various dynasties and kingdoms. Then the Persians came. Then the Greeks came. Then the Romans came. Then the Byzantines came. And then, sort of starting, I'll call it modern Egypt, the Muslim Arabs prevailed. And so that, with, apologies to the Egyptologists who may be out there, in my view, this is Egypt in an eggshell. In the early days of Egyptian civilization, they developed a form of writing that we call hieroglyphics. And these are examples of Egyptian hieroglyphics. This tradition went on for centuries. But by the time of the Roman era, the tradition ended up getting lost. People didn't write this way anymore, and there was nobody left who knew what this writing meant. So it became a mystery. In 1798, Napoleon launched a large force to Egypt, aiming to reduce British influence in that part of the world. Along with his military forces, he had a large contingent of savants. These are scholars who would study the ancient culture of Egypt. This was one of the main focuses of the French. Well, obviously, in those days, there was a lot of conflict between the French and the English. So the English Navy pursued the French there in the Eastern Mediterranean, long conflicts. But in 1799, a team working under a French officer at Rosetta in Egypt, modern Rashid, uncovered a large stone. One of Napoleon's savants thought that it might be significant. Well, this was a slab of granite-like material, 4 feet tall, 2.5 feet wide, a foot thick. It had three types of writings. On the top, there were Egyptian hieroglyphics, 14 lines long. Unfortunately, there were originally a whole lot more, but the top was broken off. Then in the middle, there was a then unknown script, later called Egyptian Demotic, which is, I think, in symbol terms, a sort of simplified version of hieroglyphics. But then at the bottom, for 53 lines long, there was classical Greek. And the classical Greek text stated that it was the same as the two previous writings. In other words, this was a trilingual inscription dated to around 2,200 years ago. Well, the French and the British and the French, they went round and round, and finally the French surrendered. The British got the Rosetta Stone, which now sits in the British Museum in London. The Egyptians keep saying they want it back. The British keep saying, no, we're keeping it. This is what it looks like. The picture on the right reflects the Rosetta Stone, and the inserts on the left, the one on the bottom shows the Greek text on the bottom, and the one on the upper one is the last line of the Egyptian hieroglyphic writing and then moving into this demotic writing. The discovery of the Rosetta Stone was much publicized in Europe, and one fellow who developed an interest in it was a man named Thomas Young. He was trained as a physician, but he inherited a lot of money, literally from a rich uncle. And, as a teenager, as somebody of his social class in those days would have done, he learned Latin and Greek. But he's been described as a polymath, a genius who knew a lot of various things about all kinds of things. He made contributions to the area of physics, and I have read he's said to be the last man to know everything. Well, he developed an interest in Egyptian hieroglyphics, and he guessed that some of these might have phonetic significance. He summarized his findings in the Encyclopedia Britannica in 1819. Meanwhile, across the channel in France, we come across this man, Jean-Francois Champollion. He grew up in modest circumstances. I read that his father was a bookseller and his mother was illiterate, but he had a gift for languages. He was just fascinated with learning languages. He learned Latin, Greek, Hebrew, Arabic, Sanskrit, and Persian. And what is key to all this, he also learned Coptic at some point. Now, what is Coptic? Coptic, back centuries ago, it was the vernacular language of Egypt before the Arab conquest, or maybe before the Greeks. I'm not quite sure. But as a result of all these political and cultural changes, it was basically supplanted by Arabic. The vernacular language of Egypt today is Arabic. Coptic has survived as the liturgical language of Egyptian Christians. And Jean-Francois guessed that Coptic was a successor to the ancient Egyptian language. Well, it's turned out to be right. But anyway, that's one of the languages he learned. At 16 years old, he presented his first scholarly paper on place names in ancient Egypt. Think about it. What are today's teenagers doing? Soccer practice, video games, TikTok. Well, anyway, that's what this fellow did. In any event, he's the one who figured out the structure of Egyptian hieroglyphic writing, which is a combination of phonetic and other symbols. He formally presented his findings in an address in 1822 in Paris to the Academy of Inscriptions. Think about this. In 1822 in Paris, they had a learned society called the Academy of Inscriptions, where people met and listened to presentations about the interpretation of ancient inscriptions. He memorialized his findings in his famous letter to Monsieur Dacier, the secretary of the Academy. He died early. His brother, Jacques Joseph, I forgot to say that even though he grew up in modest circumstances, his brother had some success in life and supported Jean-Francois's academic pursuits. Anyway, his brother completed the Egyptian grammar and Egyptian dictionary. There he is, Jean-Francois. Well, we now move to a different part of the world, the Americas. The exact timing and means of the original population of the Americas are the subject of a lot of academic study. I'll put it that way. I think the current view is that people came from Northeast Asia, basically Siberia, and that area in two different ways. During the last ice age, what is now called the Bering Strait between Siberia and Alaska. Because of the lower sea level, it was a land bridge. So a lot of people came over the land bridge, but I think there's a lot of significant thinking these days that a number of other people came along the coast, maybe in canoes or similar vessels. And when did this happen? At least 13,000 years ago, long time ago. The details are still not well known. You had various people coming over to the Americas, and well, they spoke languages. And the exact number of languages that were spoken in the Americas, say at the time of Columbus's voyages, are not known. But in North and Central America, it was probably in the hundreds. And the exact classification and relationships of these languages are still not well established, but here is one I will call simple representation of how this may have been. You see in the far north, the purple, the Eskimo Aleut languages. Then in the far northwest, the orange area, the Athabascan languages. And then the big green area used to be called Algonquian. It's now called Algic. You have the Iroquoian languages in the northeast. You have the Siouan languages in the plains. You have the red, the Uto-Aztecan languages in the American West going down into Mexico. You have the Cilician languages in the Pacific Northwest. You have the Mayan languages there in Yucatan and neighboring areas. These are the 9 major language families. Now, the gray areas are either small groups of languages or languages that are called isolates because they cannot be related to any other. And one thing that's really significant is there in southern Washington state and Oregon and going down the California coast, a very complex and extremely diverse group of languages. Well, what do you make of this? Some people could just shrug their shoulders and say, who cares? Some people are intellectually curious and might want to investigate what's going on here. So, during the course of the 19th century, we have 2 important things that developed. One was obviously the relationships between the Native Americans and the European settlers and their descendants was a very difficult and complicated subject. And there were all kinds of conflicts, including physical conflicts. Over the course of some decades in the 19th century, effectively this was resolved where the Native Americans agreed or were forced to agree to give up their claims to their native territories in exchange for living on defined reservations. And in exchange for that, the federal government agreed to provide them with various social benefits. So here you have a map of what is today the Native American reservations. The federal government recognizes over 500 tribes of Native Americans, and there are over 300 of these defined reservations in the continental US. And according to the last census, there are over 1 million people who live on these reservations. Some of them are quite large, some of them are very small. You can see the Navajo area there in Arizona spreading into New Mexico and small areas in Utah and Colorado. Compare that, it looks like it's bigger than the states of Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island combined. And you see other these, green areas plus lots of smaller ones. As I said, there are over 300. You have this arrangement, I'll put it that way, between the majority of Americans represented by the federal government and the Native Americans. Well, then what happens? Here is a very interesting man named Johns Hopkins. He lived in Baltimore. He made a lot of money in the world of railroads and banking back in the 19th century. He was a Quaker with a great interest in philanthropy. He was never married, he never had any children. In his will, he left $7 million to found a hospital, an orphan's home, and a university. At that time, in 1870, this was the largest philanthropic gift ever made in the United States. The university was founded, well, named after him, Johns Hopkins University, in 1876. And it was very unusual then because it was the first university in the United States devoted to serious research in terms of graduate programs leading to the PhD degree based on the German model. Well, here is a picture of the modern university, Johns Hopkins, and it's very interesting. Its motto is, in Latin, Veritas vos liberabit. The truth shall set you free. Think about it in today's modern terms. We move to another place, Columbia University. The graduate research German-based model that was started at Johns Hopkins spread to other places, including Columbia. And at Columbia, we meet a very interesting fellow, Franz Boas. Franz Boas was born in Germany. He studied physics. He got a PhD in physics. Again, this is German universities back in those days doing research and offering the PhD degree. He got a PhD degree in physics. His dissertation was on the color of water. Well, he got interested in what was then called geography, and he went on an expedition to Canada with some people where he encountered various indigenous peoples of Canada, and he got fascinated with their cultures and their languages and all. Well, to make a long story short, in 1899, he became a professor of anthropology at Columbia, and he organized the Department of Anthropology there. It's the first department at a university in the United States that offered a PhD in anthropology. And he had some interesting students. One is Alfred Kroeber, who got the first PhD in anthropology at Columbia in 1901 and went to California to found with somebody else the anthropology program at the university in Berkeley and contributed a lot to the study of the culture of the native peoples of the Western United States and their languages, including in California. Other students of Franz Boas at Columbia were Ruth Benedict and Margaret Mead, both of whom, including Alfred Kroeber, are well known in the history of American anthropology. But then we come to another student of Franz Boas, Edward Sapir. Edward Sapir, according to his biographer, was a linguist, an anthropologist, and a humanist. Fascinating career. Born in what was then Germany, now Poland. His family were Lithuanian Jews. His first language was Yiddish. His family ended up moving to the United States. He went to college at Columbia, and then he got a PhD at Columbia in anthropology. He wrote his PhD dissertation on the Takelma language a Native American language in southwestern Oregon. I mean, this was not just an academic study. He went there and, studied it and learned about the people and all. He spent 15 years working for the Geological Survey of Canada. He lived in Ottawa. At the time, it was sort of a complicated thing, but the Geological Survey wanted some anthropologists to be associated with them. So he founded their anthropological division. And in 1921, while he was working there in Canada, he published this book called Language, an Introduction to the Study of Speech, which was maybe not the first, but one of the first general books about modern linguistics. He ended up the last 8 years of his life the head of the anthropology department at Yale and had a number of very interesting students. But just to give some idea of everything he did, as I said, his PhD dissertation, he studied the Takelma language in Oregon. Its relationship to other languages is not certain. He worked with a woman named Frances Johnson, who was one of the last fluent speakers of Takelma. She died in 1934, and that language no longer exists as a spoken language. He also worked with the Wishram Chinook. That's a language that no longer exists as a spoken language. The Yana language in California no longer exists. He studied Paiute, Nootka, and Comox, and he did a lot of work on what's called the classification of Native American languages, which is trying to figure out how they are related to one another in terms of language families. That's Edward Sapir. We now come to Leonard Bloomfield, who had a different career path. He got his PhD at Chicago, focusing on Germanic linguistics, and he taught at various places. And in 1933, he published his famous book, Language, which is another major work on general linguistics. He had his later career at Yale, and he studied various languages, but he made major contributions to Native American linguistics, especially the Algonquian, or now called the Algic languages, Cree, Ojibwe, Fox, and Menominee. Cree is viable, Ojibwe is viable, Fox seems to be marginally viable, and what I've read about Menominee, it's almost extinct. Think about this. Edward Sapir and Leonard Bloomfield and many other people continuing down today, there's an implicit problem, or at least intellectual curiosity, about all these hundreds of languages of Native Americans. And how do we analyze them? How do we record them in terms of preserving them? The solution is what these people did, Sapir and Bloomfield, they rolled up their sleeves. They went out to places that were probably not that comfortable to live in for months at a time and developed friendships with the local people and analyzed these languages. They wrote grammars, they wrote dictionaries, they collected texts. So there's an implicit problem here, or if not an overt problem, and there are solutions, and there are people who contributed to these solutions. There's Leonard Bloomfield. All right, we now move to modern Turkey, known in the past as Anatolia. And there's some very significant linguistic events going on here. In 1906, archaeologists excavating in central Turkey uncovered thousands of clay tablets with writing in the cuneiform script. Some of this writing goes back to around 3,700 years ago. It was called Hittite since it was discovered at Boğazkale, the site of ancient Hattusa, the center of the Hittite Empire. This cuneiform writing was well known from prior discoveries, primarily in Mesopotamia. Cuneiform is a Latin word that means wedge-shaped, and the writing was done using a wedge-shaped stylus on soft clay, which was then left to harden. And this is how they wrote, back in the day. But in this case, here in central Turkey, the writing, the script was well known, but the language was not. But what happened was a Czech scholar of ancient languages and writing systems named Bedřich Hrozný published an article in 1915 concluding that the language of these tablets that I showed in the previous slide was Indo-European, and he followed this in 1917 by a grammar. This is what Hrozný was confronting. Here is a slide. We all recognize the script. It's the normal Roman alphabet with some diacritics here and there. And we assume that, the letter N is pronounced like an N, and the letter T is pronounced like a T, and the letter R is pronounced like an R, and so on and so forth. Well, this is what he was confronting. The script was familiar, cuneiform, but nobody knew what the language was. For the purpose of this illustration, I pulled this document off a website of an Albanian newspaper. The language is Albanian, which I think probably very few people participating in this program would recognize. But this is what Professor Hrozný, the sort of thing he was dealing with. Here he is. He studied Asian and African languages, especially the older varieties, at Vienna. He became a professor at Vienna, and then for many years he was a professor at the Charles University in Prague. And just think about that career. 1919, it was right after the First World War. Well, you had the Roaring Twenties, you had the economic depression, you had the Nazi Germans occupying Prague, you had the communists taking over. It must have been a very difficult career that he had, but he's the one who's credited for interpreting these tablets, these thousands of tablets, or the language of these thousands of tablets that were discovered there in central Turkey. He concluded in 1915 that the language of these tablets was Indo-European, but that became very controversial. The problem is with Hittite is it has some characteristics that are strikingly Indo-European on the classical sort of Sanskrit, Greek, Latin model, but other characteristics that are not like Indo-European. So did it fit into or was it out of Professor Schleicher's tree model? Well, the modern consensus is Hittite and several related but less well-attested languages in that area, collectively referred to as Anatolian. They were Indo-European, but they diverged from Proto-Indo-European at an early date. So, problem. What was that language? Well, Hrozný concluded it was Hittite Indo-European, and that was the solution that he proposed. And that solution has more or less survived down to the present day. In 1933, Adolf Hitler was elected Chancellor of Germany. Under his leadership, Germany became more and more aggressive. And 5 years later, in 1938, Germany annexed Austria. This is the infamous Anschluss. Here's a photo of Hitler parading through the streets of Vienna to celebrate this event. In that same year, in 1938, in England, there was a man, Sir Hugh Sinclair, who In anticipation of possible war, he was the head of the British Secret Intelligence Service, MI6. He bought a country estate in Buckinghamshire for £6,000 sterling to be used for an undisclosed purpose. The government wouldn't put up the £6,000. He paid for it out of his own pocket. And this estate, it was Bletchley Park. The real purpose of this endeavor, organized by Sir Hugh, was to figure out what the Germans were up to by decoding their ciphers, especially the Enigma cipher. Here is a picture on the right of the famous Enigma cipher machine that the Germans used. It's about the size of an old-fashioned typewriter. It was portable, and the cipher that it was encoding and also used on the other side to decode, it was supposed to be impenetrable. Sir Hugh began to assemble a team of code breakers, including mathematicians, including the famous, brilliant mathematician from Cambridge, Alan Turing. And there's a picture there, a photo of Alan Turing, who not only was, a brilliant mathematician, but also one of the founders of the modern computer science. They also recruited chess champions and crossword puzzle enthusiasts on the theory that they had great analytical skills. And then, of course, they had to have language experts. They called them linguists, but they were not trained in linguistics in the modern sense, but they knew languages, especially German. I mean, think about it. If you're lucky to decode a German message, well, it's in German. I mean, the German language. And it's not your sort of ordinary sort of German 101 kind of language. It's a military message full of abbreviations and jargon and this and that. And they needed people to be able to translate and interpret these messages. So that was another category of people they had. Well, the inevitable happened. The next year, on September 1st, 1939, Germany invaded Poland. 2 days later, Great Britain declared war on Germany. The activities at Bletchley Park ramped up, partly due to errors made by the Germans and partly due to previous decoding work done in Poland. The team at Bletchley Park were able to understand the Germans' encrypted messages. At the peak of this activity during the war, the team of some hundreds of people were reading 4,000 messages a day. Commentators believe that the work at Bletchley Park shortened the war by at least 2 years. These activities at Bletchley Park were not only top secret, but they tried to keep them more than top secret without much information disclosed until 30 years after the war. This would have been in the 1970s. And then, since there were so many men deployed into military service, around 75% of the staff at Bletchley Park were women. Here's a photo of women operating the famous Colossus computer at Bletchley Park during the war. This Colossus computer was developed there. It's the first or one of the first modern computers, and it was used to help in the decoding effort. There's a whole interesting story about this computer and the history of computers that you can go into. I'm not going into it now, but it's just fascinating. And in any event, there's Bletchley Park. For some decades now, it's been a museum devoted to the activities that all of these people did during the Second World War. It's a 40-minute train ride from London. I've never been there, but I have been told by some friends that it's a fascinating and just lovely place to visit. Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, On December 7th, 1941, the Japanese attacked the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. The next day, on December the 8th, President Roosevelt appeared before Congress. Congress passed a declaration of war against Japan, and the president signed it. That's a photo of him doing that. All this happened within a few hours. Well, this was going to be a different kind of war from, for example, what the American forces had been experiencing in the First World War, which is basically a land battle on the continent of Europe. So there's Hawaii there, sort of in the far right, and the Pacific Ocean, and all these islands. And the war there in the Pacific was going to be, well, there were going to be battles at sea conducted, organized, or dealt with by the Navy. But trying to move westward from Hawaii through all these islands was a task for the Marines to take island by island. We come across a really fascinating fellow, Philip Johnston. He grew up on the Navajo reservation in Arizona, where his parents were missionaries. And it's said that, well, his playmates were all Navajos, and he learned to speak fluent Navajo. He served in the U.S. Army in the First World War, including in France. He then studied civil engineering and worked for the city of Los Angeles in the water department. That may sound kind of dull or ordinary, but if you know anything about Southern California, you know that organizing and maintaining an adequate supply of water, particularly during an era of rapid growth, it was a really, really big deal. When the Second World War broke out, he contacted the Marines and convinced them to use bilingual Navajo English speakers to encode military messages in the Pacific theater. I don't know what alternatives the Marines had, but after some initial demonstrations, they were eager to pursue this idea. And this project was successful. The Japanese were unable to decipher the transmissions made by the Navajos. Here's some photos of these Navajo men in action. I especially like the one in the upper right. Here's one fellow talking on the radio. I'm sure he's speaking Navajo to a colleague. Who knows, maybe on the same island or a different island. And there's the other fellow sort of taking notes to record the content of the transmission. This operation was classified for over 20 years after the Second World War. The military thought that this sort of technique might need to be used in the future, but finally it was declassified. And then finally, three presidents of the United States recognized the service made by these Navajo men. And here is a photo of the second President Bush making awards to, well, they were called Navajo Code Talkers. This is in the White House, and it was what, 2001? Very significant service by these people. And some of them were as young as 17 years old when they went into this service. We now move to a different part of the world, the Greek island of Crete. In the late 19th centuries, a number of scholars came to be focused on tablets and other objects found in Crete and the adjacent Greek mainland that had what appeared to be writing on them. All these sort of scratchings and symbols and things. The form of writing and the languages involved were unknown. In 1900, some archaeologists discovered a large cache of tablets on Crete with this sort of writing, and altogether, there are 6,000 inscriptions known. For years, scholars struggled to analyze these and other similar findings. They didn't know what the writing was, they didn't know what the language was. There were lots of disputes about the history of this area. One conclusion, which has stood the test of time, is that these writings represented two languages. The scripts were named Linear A and Linear B. Linear B became the subject of a lot of study. This form of writing, Linear B, from Crete, is attested from around 3,400 years ago. This is what it looks like. Here are some photos of inscriptions of this Linear B script on tablets. Now, there are three people who are significant in the interpretation of Linear B. The first is Alice Kober. She got a PhD in Columbia in 1932 in the field of classics. And in addition to the usual classical languages of Latin and Greek, she learned other languages. She taught classics for 20 years, and she got interested in the subject of these languages or scripts or tablets and all from Crete. And she was an early proponent that Linear A and Linear B, the scripts represented different languages. And she contributed to the initial analysis of Linear B, both in terms of the nature of the script and the nature of the underlying language. She died at the age of 43 before she could pursue her initial findings. The next person involved in the interpretation of Linear B is Michael Ventris. An Englishman, he spent years in school in Switzerland. There in Switzerland, he learned the main languages of Switzerland, French and German. And of course, he studied Latin and Greek in school in those days. And later in life, he learned Russian. After school, he started to study architecture. The Second World War broke out. He enlisted in the Royal Air Force, where he served as a navigator. After the war, he went back to architecture school and he qualified as an architect in 1948. As a teenager, he became fascinated with the idea of interpreting Linear B. At the age of 14, he attended a lecture in London where a scholar talked about these mysterious scripts and languages from Crete, and he became virtually obsessed with this subject. People who knew him have described him as having a remarkable visual memory. He was brilliant. He had great power of concentration. He was meticulously accurate. He had beautiful drafting skills. That's part of his architectural life. And he was charming, but modest. The third person involved in the interpretation of Linear B is John Chadwick. John Chadwick studied classics. In the Second World War, he served in the Royal Navy, and he also served at Bletchley Park. Now, the people at Bletchley Park were mostly focused on what the Germans were doing, but they also monitored what the Japanese were doing. And John Chadwick was assigned to I'll call it the Japanese department. And he didn't know Japanese, but he studied Japanese and learned Japanese and worked in that area. And then after the war, he taught classics at Cambridge for many years. Well, just look at him, the very model of an English Don. Would you not want to have been able to study Homer and Virgil with him? In 1952, Michael Ventris gave a talk on BBC Radio. And he said, quote, "I have come to the conclusion that the tablets must, after all, be written in Greek. a difficult and archaic Greek, seeing that it is 500 years older than Homer and written in a rather abbreviated form, but Greek nevertheless. Unquote. Just think about it. In those days, the radio broadcasts sophisticated intellectual talks like this. John Chadwick heard this talk on the radio. He and Michael Ventris developed a collaboration. In the following year, they published an article called Evidence for Greek Dialect in the Mycenaean Archives, promoting Michael Ventris's proposal that the language of Linear B was Greek. This finding, with the understanding that Ventris had the benefit of Alice Cober's initial thoughts and he had the support of this scholar from Cambridge. But anyway, the conclusion that Linear B is Greek is generally attributed to Michael Ventris. 3 years later, Michael Ventris died in a car wreck, leaving behind a wife and 2 children. That was Linear B. As for Linear A, it has never been interpreted. It remains a mystery. We now move to a different part of the world, Central America. Here is a map. We're going to focus on the Yucatan Peninsula and south to southwest of that, the Guatemala and some of the neighboring lands. Here is the famous monument that the Maya people built in Chichen Itza in Yucatan. It's around 1,000 years old, and it's a little under 100 feet tall. Well, the Maya developed a writing system that is attested from around 2,300 years ago until the time of the Spanish conquest, around more or less 400 years ago. Among other things, the Maya prepared books known as codices with writing on bark paper. 4 of these codices have survived. There were probably many more, but during the Spanish conquest, there was a bishop from Spain named Landa who was a fanatic about wanting to eradicate indigenous culture with a view towards converting the people there to the religion that he was promoting. But 4 of these codices have survived. And also, there are many inscriptions that have been found. I mean, physical inscriptions on buildings and pottery and other objects. Here is an example, one of the most famous codices from the Mayan era is the Dresden Codex. And that shows you the writing that the Maya people developed. Well, one commentator has said, deciphering Maya writing proved a long and laborious process. Well, from what I have read, yes. Many scholars over many decades have tried to figure out what the Maya were writing. There were many ideas, many attempts, lots and lots of disputes. But from what I have read, apparently a substantial amount of Maya writing, maybe as much as 90%, has now been interpreted. And much credit is given to the Russian scholar Yuri Valentinovich Knorozov, a fascinating fellow. Here is something about him. Yuri Valentinovich Knorozov. He was described as difficult, bright, and eccentric, with a penetrating intelligence and an encyclopedic knowledge of a host of subjects. He started his academic career with a focus on Egyptology at Moscow State University. Well, the war came along, he served in the Soviet Army, and then he resumed his study of ancient languages and scripts, and he held an academic position at Moscow State University. He came across information about Maya writing and got fascinated, obsessed by it, and wrote a number of publications in the 1950s and 1960s. And he proposed that the basic structure of the Mayan writing was fundamentally logograms, which are symbols representing a whole word, plus syllabic symbols, similar to Japanese writing. It must have been a very difficult situation there, starting in the Stalinist area and then during the whole world of the Soviet Union doing all of this. But in any event, he is credited with being the main scholar who has figured out the nature of Mayan writing. After the end of the Soviet Union, when travel became more possible, he went to Mexico and Guatemala and received awards from the governments of those countries for his contributions to the study of their people and their history. Here he is, Yuri Valentinovich Knorozov. Again, people said he's brilliant, eccentric, difficult, has a penetrating intelligence, and there he is with his Siamese cat. Just to sort of wrap up a little here about this aspect of linguistic problem solving, dealing with ancient languages and the interpretation of little known languages. We have, I put these people in two columns. It's a little arbitrary, but I think you can appreciate. On the left column, you have people who are more traditional scholars, very well trained in the academic world, very meticulous, wrote academic articles and books, and made all kinds of important contributions in this area. In the right hand column, well, you have some people who are a bit different. There's William Jones. He never had an academic position, he was a lawyer and a judge. But like a lot of these people, he was fascinated with languages. What does his bio say? He learned 28 languages during the course of his life, and he had brilliant ideas. And then you have Jean Francois Champollion in the case of the Egyptian hieroglyphics. You have Michael Ventris in the case of Linear B. These are people who were, well, they both were interested in languages. They knew a lot of languages, which they studied, and they were just fascinated or even obsessed with a particular subject to get to the end of it to solve a problem. And then you have Yuri Knorozov, who had a academic position, but doesn't exactly fit in the same mold of the people in the left-hand column. He's more of a free spirit, more of a freelancer, more of a free thinker. At this point, we're going to move on to a different set of ways in which languages and linguistics have worked into the way of problem solving. We first come to central Italy. Here is a map, well, an extract of a map of central Italy. We have Rome on the left with all these highways going around it. You know, all these cities these days, they have these circular highways. Here in Houston, where I live, they call them loops and loops and loops. In some places, they call them ring roads or other things. But you go down to the sort of the south or the east southeast from Rome, near the bottom right of the map, there is a town called Palestrina. Just remember that. We come across this object that in English is called a Praeneste fibula. A fibula, it's a Latin, ancient Roman term. It means a pin, or we would call it a brooch. It was an object used on clothing to hold pieces of clothing together, but it also had a decorative function. So it was not just practical, but They were made to be bright and shiny and almost like a jewel. This one is interesting not only for the nature of the object itself, but it has an inscription on it. It's hard to read the inscription on the brooch, but down below there's a reproduction of the inscription. This object came to light in 1887, supposedly from that town Palestrina that I showed you on the map. It's been dated to around 2,700 years ago. And this inscription on the original object, it's written right to left. In those days, there was no clear convention as to the direction of writing. But what I have done here is I've written it left to right, and I have converted the original letters into classic Roman letters. And it says Manios med fe facet pneumasioi. And when this came to light, it was a sensation because this inscription, Manios med fe facet pneumasioi, at the time was viewed as the oldest example of writing in the Latin language, going back to 2,700 years ago. Now, in classical Latin, it would be Manius me fecit numerio. In English, Manius made me for Nemasius. Well, it's as though the fibula is speaking. Me is the fibula. Manius is the artisan who made it, and Nemasius is the benefactor, basically the guy who paid for it. This is the Praeneste fibula. Starting around 1980, the authenticity of this piece was questioned by various scholars. And then years passed, and the people involved in this, I think it's in a museum in Rome, this piece. They organized scientific investigations. And then by 2012, this was a little over 10 years ago, physical scientists studying the material and linguists studying the inscription, concluding that the Praeneste fibula, both the material and the language, was genuine beyond a reasonable doubt. There it is, the Praeneste fibula. Quite a story, and it's a sort of a nice positive outcome. But, there are some different stories. We now move to the Dead Sea, and in the northwest corner of the Dead Sea is a place called Qumran. And the photo in the upper right shows what this area looks like. It's pretty rugged, a lot of cliffs, and you see some holes in these cliffs. These are caves. And the bottom right is another sort of scene of this pretty rugged landscape. We move to the subject of the Dead Sea Scrolls. I mean, most people are familiar generally with these. They were discovered in the Qumran caves starting in the late 1940s to the early 1950s. They are manuscripts or fragments of manuscripts with different kinds of content, including biblical texts. And they date from around 2,300 to 1,900 years ago. Most of these are written in Hebrew. Some are written in Aramaic, which is a related Semitic language that was widely spoken in that area back in the time, and some in other languages. Almost all of them are written on parchment, which is a type of animal skin, processed animal skin, or papyrus, which is kind of a proto paper. Many of the original findings you can see in museums in Israel and Jordan. Here is probably the most famous of these. It's called the Temple Scroll. The date is uncertain. Maybe it's 2,200 years ago. It's written in Hebrew. It deals with the subject of sacrifices and practices in a temple. You see the main scroll there, this is unusual because it's all these sort of big pieces connected together. But you see there in the upper right, there's that little piece. Think about it. These things were all sort of stored in jars in those caves, around 2000 or more years ago. And after all that time, a lot of what is left is not these big pieces like this temple scroll, but that little fragment up there. Well, not long ago, a fellow named Steve Green came along. He is a successful businessman. He founded Hobby Lobby, this chain of craft stores. And he started acquiring a lot of items related to the Bible, including 16 fragments of the Dead Sea Scrolls, which he bought on the private antiquities market. And his purpose of all this was to establish a museum devoted to the Bible. Well, he and related parties and other donors, they raised an estimated $400 million to acquire an old building in Washington, D.C., near the National Mall. They ended up renovating it and expanding it as a space to house the museum. The museum opened in 2017, a little over 5 years ago. It has over 1,000 items in its permanent collection and 2,000 items on loan from other people or organizations. Here's a photo of the Museum of the Bible in Washington, D.C. It's a popular tourist attraction. Well, Steve Green donated these 16 fragments of the Dead Sea Scrolls to the museum. And at the time, some scholars questioned the authenticity of the fragments. Well, the museum, to its credit, engaged some experts to investigate this. And I say to its credit because there are a lot of museums, if something in their collection is questioned as to its authenticity or its provenance, they dig in their heels and they don't want to deal with the controversy. They want to hang on to what they have. But this museum was very open about this. And a little over 2 years ago, the panel of experts that they engaged concluded that all 16 fragments in the museum were modern forgeries. In the last 20 years or so, other collectors have acquired similar fragments in the private antiquities market. And there are some scholars who believe that most, if not all of these, are also modern forgeries. The prices of these have not been clearly disclosed, but some of these fragments could have been bought for as much as $500,000 apiece. How did these experts come to the conclusion that these fragments are forgeries? Well, one is provenance. Where did these things come from? The subject is not clear. The chain of ownership and all murky. The textual content, the condition and color of the material studied by physical experts. And then there's the subject of paleography. Paleography is the study of ancient handwriting. And it's not traditionally viewed as part of the field of linguistics, but in a broad sense it is, because handwriting is a physical representation of speech. And the study of handwriting is, in a sense, a study of language. Well, anyway, the experts in paleography determined that, at least in the case of these 16 fragments, there were just irregularities that could not be explained in terms of relating these to what were undisputably genuine findings that were clearly established from, say, the 1940s and 1950s. 2,000 years ago, the Romans, speaking Latin, had some advice, caveat emptor. It means let the buyer beware. Well, here we come to today's hot topic, artificial intelligence. This has been defined as intelligence demonstrated by machines as opposed to intelligence displayed by living biological creatures. And some of the AI applications that we're all familiar with, the first one is web search engines. You know, when the internet got commercialized, when was it, 30 years ago? It's this great innovation, all this information available, but how do you find what you're looking for or what you want to learn about? Well, various people came up with these, what we call search engines, and there were a number of them. Back in the day, it's all sort of gotten boiled down to Google search today, although Microsoft has a search engine called Bing, which they're trying to enhance. Well, going back to the context of what I've been talking about of problems and solutions, the problem with the original internet was how did you find anything? And the solution was the search engine. Well, we then get to self-driving cars. Some people find driving a problem. It's a tedious, time-consuming exercise. When you're driving out there, you can't do anything else. There are people trying to develop these self-driving cars. The idea is you, the owner of the car, could just sit there. The car would drive you somewhere, and you could do something useful while you're being driven by this automated system, doing something useful like deleting emails. We then come to the chatbot. A chatbot is a software application used to conduct an online chat conversation with text or text to speech instead of providing direct contact with a live human agent. You know, back in the past, if you had problems with a device or an appliance or something, you would go to the manufacturer's website and there would be an 800 number that you could call and talk to a person to try to solve whatever problem it was. But all these companies have tried to move away from that. And so you go to one of these companies' websites, it's hard to drill down and find an 800 number. What they have typically in the lower right-hand screen is a what's called a chatbot. So it's a system where you can type a search term or a question in to try to solve your problem with whatever device or product you have. And you are dealing with not a live human being, but with what's called a virtual agent. And they use this, or they're promoting this for what they call customer service, or in a lot of cases, I would call it so-called service. In late 2022, literally at the end of November, literally less than 3 months ago, this new type of artificial intelligence arrived on the scene called generative artificial intelligence. The iconic program is ChatGPT, which has been produced by a startup company named OpenAI. The program's name stands for Chat Generative Pre-trained Transformer. And this program, ChatGPT, can generate all kinds of text, including questions, ideas, papers, computer codes, song lyrics, and so on and so forth. It can also generate images and videos and music, but I'm not going to deal with those. I'm going to deal with its ability to generate text, that is language. This company, OpenAI, was founded by a fellow named Sam Altman. He's around 37 years old. He studied computer science at Stanford, but he dropped out and he had various positions in Silicon Valley. Here is a photo of Sam Altman. Given what's going on, I think you need to focus on looking at him because I think his image is going to be more and more prominent in the coming weeks and months and years. This has turned out to be a really hot area. So far, Microsoft has invested $3 billion in OpenAI, the company that developed ChatGPT, founded by Sam Altman. On January 24th, less than a month before I am preparing this presentation, Microsoft announced that it would make an additional multi-year, multi-billion-dollar investment. And the story on the street is this is $10 billion. Much of this money will go to develop the huge computing power needed to run this business. And other big tech companies are scrambling to compete. As reported on January 20th, again, less than a month, Google declared a code red and recalled its founders, Sergey Brin and Larry Page, who had mostly withdrawn from the company. Google plans to develop as many as 20 competing products and enhance existing products. And then, as reported a couple of weeks ago, Google will release an experimental chatbot named Bard to compete with ChatGPT, and Google will enhance its search engine with more AI features. Then, as reported not long ago, on the first page of the New York Times, Microsoft sets off a tech race with its AI assisted search, companies betting big on chatbots that write and plan. Some observers have noted that these types of programs can produce toxic content, including misinformation, hate speech, and biased presentations. And teachers have become concerned that ChatGPT will lead to rampant cheating. School systems in New York City and Seattle have banned or restricted ChatGPT and other what they call cheating tools from their computers and networks. Here's an article in the New York Times on January 16th, about a month ago. The headline, Alarmed by AI Chatbots, Universities Start Revamping How They Teach. It reported a story about a professor of philosophy at Northern Michigan University who assigned his class to write papers. One student turned in what the professor viewed as the best paper in the class. But the professor got suspicious and confronted the student. And the student admitted that he didn't write the paper, he got ChatGPT to write the paper. Well, permit me to reminisce a bit. Back in the old days, a student in this position who didn't want to be bothered to write a paper or was insecure about writing a paper would pay someone, that is another person, to write a paper, and that student would then turn in that work product as his own. Well, then the internet came along and you didn't have to pay somebody to do this. You could just do a big copy and paste job and turn in things that you found on the internet as your own work product. Well, here we are at the next level. You get this software program to write the paper for you. Well, this professor now requires students to write a first draft of a paper in class with systems that block certain sources, like I'm sure ChatGPT. And then he requires the students to explain changes in later versions. This article went on to say that other professors are said to be moving away from traditional papers and focusing on oral presentations, group work, and handwritten submissions. Another article in the New York Times, the headline says, is ChatGPT a new method of cheating or a new tool for education? And this is focusing on not the university world, but the world of probably, I'm going to say, maybe junior high and high school, or now it's called middle school and high school. Some teachers don't like the idea of policing what their students are doing or becoming adversarial with them. And some people are saying, well, maybe let's treat Chat GPT like calculators to allow it for some uses but not others. Or maybe Chat GPT can be a useful teaching tool. In other words, you use Chat GPT to create an outline of an essay and then write the essay in longhand. Or maybe teachers themselves could use Chat GPT to generate lesson plans and ideas for activities. A couple weeks ago, a journalist in the New York Times wrote an article, and this is a writer, a journalist for the New York Times. And the headline said, "Today's column was brought to you with the help of AI bots." And the byline, ChatGPT isn't the only writing assistant to emerge. We tested it with two others to assess strengths and weaknesses. The other two writing assistants are Word Tune Spices and Writer. Well, I think it's interesting. He doesn't refer to these as chatbots, he refers to them as writing assistants. This journalist's conclusion: artificial intelligence can be an effective tool for improving our work, that is, the work of journalists. The AI bots were useful for sharpening prose and cleaning up clunky, ungrammatical sentences. Well, let's think about this in a not real long historical context. Until recently, if an author, a journalist, or somebody was thinking about how can I sharpen my prose or how can I clean up my sentences, the work was done by somebody called an editor. Are these writing assistants, these chatbots, going to replace the work of what was done historically by an editor? A question for you. Getting to the end of this, Bill Gates has said Chat GPT is going to change our world. Elon Musk has said Chat GPT is scary good. So the questions I leave you with is generative AI in the form of Chat GPT and its rivals a solution or a problem? Or is generative AI in the form of Chat GPT and its rivals both a solution and a problem? This ends the main area of my presentation. I want to move on to a few other quick things. I want to give some credits first to my wife, Christine, who for a long time taught classics at Rice University. And on a personal note, I want to say that Christine would have made a great candidate to work at Bletchley Park, not only because of her knowledge of these difficult ancient languages, but also the fact that on most days she can complete the crossword puzzle in the New York Times. I also want to thank Matthias Hense, professor of biblical studies at Rice, who gave me some interesting and helpful information about the Dead Sea Scrolls. Then the Fondren Library at Rice and the people who work there is just a tremendous resource and place to do research. And Katie DeVore, who is just a genius at helping me create a presentation like this. I have some references, a couple of pages of references, and then there's information where you can contact me with any comments or questions or criticisms or supplements or anything you want to add or contact me about. And then there's some supplemental information about some things that I did not include in the main body of the presentation due to space and time limitations. So thank you so much for participating in this, and please get in touch with me if you have anything to say. Goodbye.